Find a new way to live in Toronto's coveted Forest Hill neighborhood. Foray by Canderel blends thoughtful, livable suite design with refined finishes and more than 50,000 square feet of amenities, including wellness spaces, work-from-home areas, fitness facilities, and places to unwind. A modern, elevated community crafted for the life you've earned. Your next home starts from $599,000. Learn more at live@foray.ca. That's live at FORET.ca.
This is a very, very difficult time for Jewish people, and we know that with the rise in anti-Semitism and the number of acts of violence that are going on, anything that is going to fan the flames of Jew hatred has to be scrupulously considered. Is this the right time? And is this the right way? And repeatedly, that question's been asked, and it seems to just fall on deaf ears.
That's the voice of Gail Asper, philanthropist and daughter of the late Israel Asper, the founder of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, where in just a few weeks, on June 27th, a controversial exhibit opens. It's called Palestine Uprooted, Nakba Past and Present. The federally run National Museum says it'll showcase how Israeli troops and militias forced 750,000 Palestinians out of their homes during the 1948 Israel War of Independence, and how the descendants of these refugees in Canada still experience ongoing displacement 5 generations later. The museum says, quote, the exhibit explores the human rights violations related to the ongoing forced displacement and dispossession of Palestinians today, shows a recent image of the war in Gaza, and promises to show, quote, the ongoing struggle for justice and human rights and enduring patterns of loss and resistance, unquote. Now, last fall, after the museum announced the exhibit, pro-Israel Jewish advocacy groups swung into action. CJA, Winnipeg's Jewish Federation, and the local Holocaust Education Center, among others, all expressed concerns to the museum team. And they offered to provide the wider context of what happened, because they say that framing places responsibility almost exclusively on Israel, while omitting crucial historical facts, including the wider war, the role of invading Arab armies, and the parallel displacement of a similar number of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Arab countries. The critics say the context, though, isn't the only problem. It's also the exhibit's advisory panel, which they allege includes people with strong anti-Israel views. One is the niece of a former PLO official in Paris who Israel assassinated in 1972 in retaliation for the terrorist attack that killed 11 Israeli Olympic athletes in Munich. Now, one of those critics is a constitutional scholar and law professor and a rabbi, Brian Schwartz. He's co-author of a new book examining both the exhibit and the process behind it. He says another person on the exhibit's advisory panel is a local Palestinian activist who celebrated the October 7th massacre and its mastermind, slain Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar.
The Canadian Museum of Human Rights, by officially listing these people as an advisory committee, has legitimated vile, false, and hateful statements about Israel and, with that, the Jewish people.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, June 1st, 2026. Welcome to North Star, the flagship podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Gronowski-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. In recent months, opponents of the exhibit have intensified their campaign. In mid-May, Israel's lawfare organization Shurat Hadin sent a legal letter to the museum advising that it would pursue further action, alleging the forthcoming exhibit presents a deeply one-sided anti-Israel narrative. The museum told us it rejects these suggestions that their upcoming exhibit lacks scholarly rigor. They say it's been developed responsibly with extra layers of internal and external reviewers, especially because of the fraught times in which it lands, and because the museum wants to do what it can to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian racism. But it won't release the list of who those experts were until opening day. Museum officials also say they won't be making any changes to the physical exhibit. They might be open to rethinking online messaging and public programming later. None of this is satisfactory to Gail Asper or Brian Schwartz, and they both join me now.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on, because we're coming up to maybe a couple of weeks from the projected launch of the exhibit at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, which your late father founded and you built it. And so we need to explain to our listeners and our viewers some of the things that are troubling you and, what the controversy is. Can we start with the title of the exhibit and the use of the word Nakba?
So I worked to develop the museum from its inception when my father, Israel Asper, had the idea back in 2000. And he passed away very suddenly in 2003, 5 months after announcing the concept of the museum to the public. But I remember at the announcement of the concept of the museum, he was asked by a journalist, will this museum talk about the Palestinian refugees? And my father very clearly stated he would have no problem with discussing the Palestinian refugees as long as there was historical context for the displacement. And most importantly to him, we talked about the displacement of the 850,000 Jewish people from all the Arab lands that had happened at the same time. So fast forward a number of years, I have been on the board of the Human Rights Museum since it was established as an entity in 2008. And I repeated that a number of years ago when, because I guess your question is really about the word Nakba. And when this idea of this exhibit came forward, and I can get into how that came to be, the one thing I clearly said was, you cannot use the word Nakba. A federal national institution, Canadian institution, cannot use the word Nakba, which means catastrophe, and there's interpretations of which catastrophe it refers to. But I said, that is a Palestinian word. A national federal institution cannot be describing what will be interpreted as the creation of the state of Israel as a Nakba, as a catastrophe, because Canada voted for the creation of Israel in the UN partition plan, and it recognizes Israel, and so that would be insane to be calling it a Nakba. So I said, absolutely, that word needs to come out of the exhibit.
And you're on the board still as a trustee. How?
Well, no,
not anymore. Honorary.
I have not been invited to a board meeting in a few years now. So I have not been around the table as this has been developed.
All right. So you had no way to stop it except with public pressure and private pressure.
Correct.
And Brian, do you want to weigh in on the broader picture of why you worked hard recently into your article to put the legal points and the framework of how the museum came to be in focus then, and how it's not meeting its sort of legal obligations?
The book, it's called The Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and it's, quote, Nakba, close quote, exhibit. Bias and animus in process and outcome and the nature and impact of the new anti-Semitism in Canada, which would give you some sense of it. I attempted to locate this story episode in the context of what we can call the new anti-Semitism in Canada, the new fashionable anti-Semitism, in which a hate movement now dresses itself up as anti-Zionism rather than forthrightly, traditionally anti-Semitic, with the same results, the same hatred, and the same consequences for the ability of Jews in this country to have a sense that they are protected and respected in this country. I want to be clear about a few things. We're not just talking about something that's going to happen. Things have already happened. The museum created a Palestinian Content Advisory Committee whose members on the public record have made statements like Zionism is a disease that must be destroyed. In the book, we painstakingly looked at the public record of members of this so-called Palestinian Content Advisory Committee. You would be hard-pressed to find one who accepts the legitimacy of the state of Israel as a Jewish homeland. You will find many inflammatory statements about disease, virus, genocide, apartheid. And it's not just how this is going to affect the content. The Canadian Museum of Human Rights, by officially listing these people as an advisory committee, has legitimated vile, false, and hateful statements about Israel and with that, the Jewish people. The museum has already posted its potted history of the origin of the Palestinian refugee issue. They play the double game of saying, we're not diving into history. You're not diving into history, you're pile driving the Jewish presence out of history by presenting a condensed version of the events of 47 and 48, which is entirely hostile to Israel. The original title was Palestine Displaced. What, the entire country was displaced? Palestine, like the entire country belonged exclusively to Palestinian Arabs, and there wasn't a place in there for the Jewish homeland. In 1948, there was an attempted genocide of what was left of the Jewish people in what is now Israel. The Jews accepted the two-state solution. There was supposed to be a Palestinian state. There was supposed to be a Jewish state. The Arabs rejected it. 5 Arab armies invaded Israel, and if they had destroyed Israel, which was the project, it would have been the end of Jewish civilization. The term Nakba originally was coined to mean the failure of Arab armies and Arab politicians to destroy Israel. It was a genocidal project. It failed, and the catastrophe, as originally coined by the Arab journalist who invented the phrase, was not that there was Palestinian displacement. It was that failure to destroy Israel.
It's Canadian Museum for Human Rights,
For
and that
human
four, the 4 was chosen, very carefully by us to say this was intended to be a force, not just to come in and pontificate, but to actually move human rights forward. And we can see from our perspective, as I have repeatedly said to the board and to, governments, that it's becoming a force for, in my view, anti-Jewish propaganda at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise.
Now, the Canadian Human Rights is a center for anti-Israel, anti-Jewish agitprop. The situation could not be more serious.
Yeah, and I will offer up some concern that I have had as a board member at some of the smaller instances of that kind of anti-Israel stance in many other places in the museum, but they were, always explained away. For example, things that are put in very, quickly and quietly without context. For me, I think, and Brian, you'd agree, the thing that is most concerning and upsetting is the willful disinterest in context. Because context matters, history matters. And when I asked the CEO of the CMHR, Aisha Khan, about will there be historical context, the answer was no. It was basically, this is about the narratives about displaced people in general, using the Palestinians as an example, just about displacement. So, when you put in feelings, you don't seem to have to put in facts, but people need to understand the context, because I think, with people understanding what Israel is today, it's really important to understand what Israel was or was not in 1948.
You'd never know that a major cause of the Holocaust was the betrayal of the promise of the mandatory power and the international community to provide a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That's one of the reasons the Holocaust occurred, is there was no place to escape. You'd never know that a coalition between the Nazis and some of the senior Palestinian leaders contributed to that.
The Mufti, yeah, of course.
You would never know that want to talk about displacement. Where did the displaced people from Europe go? Where did the displaced people from the Islamic world go? Well, let me mention something else. Not only is Israel never mentioned in a positive way, the first time it's going to be mentioned seriously at the museum is to vilify it.
People say, well, you haven't seen the exhibit. And I said, well, it's pretty clear in the website, where you have ample room for context. The website, they've kind of doubled down, I would say. And there's going to be a study guide, apparently, that will be, passing that kind of perspective along. And that, I joked, I said, that would be like starting a website about World War II. In 1944, Americans bombed Dresden. Like no concept, like out of the blue, America just bombed Dresden. So, it's again, how you can see the perspectives that they start with.
The list of the advisory committee, it's not on the website, but people have done research into an old version of it. Do we know at all? Do we have any intelligence that these are still the people they're consulting to do this exhibit?
Well,
I'll say, because I did make a presentation at the, urgings of those, around me to talk to the board. So I asked for a presentation slot in their recent board meeting. When asked about the content and challenging him, I actually played the one of the videos of one of the guys involved with, who was listed before, with him at a rally screaming all Zionists are racist, and then he's co-opting a young boy to scream all Zionists are racist. The museum took ownership of this exhibit. They said anybody that was on the advisory council, even if they had racist views, did not necessarily prohibit them from having thoughts that they might want to include in this exhibit. So I thought that was pretty shocking that they refused to ask any of these people to step down and didn't issue any apologies to the Jewish community or distance themselves from these people. But they did say, this is a museum exhibit. These advisory council is informing the exhibit, but the museum proudly owns the exhibit. It's not, a partnership. So they have the ability to do whatever they want to modify and improve and clarify on this exhibit. It's the museum's exhibit.
What about consultation with Jewish groups?
There have been requests for the last 2 years before this was even announced. When I was on the board, the museum received a huge campaign from the Palestinian community. Board members received hundreds of letters demanding an exhibit. That is fair. Any community can do that. And I did say at the board at that time, a researcher came forward and said, we'd like to do this exhibit. And I think it was definitely motivated by the fact that they were pressed to do it, which, is not exactly how a museum should come up with its exhibit plan. So I made it very clear very recently, that's the way it's got to go. And then thought we could trust the museum leadership to listen and to respect the founders' views. Without Izzy Asper and me, there would be no museum. So I felt we had a pretty good chance that they would respect a not unreasonable position. But no, we found out just a few months ago that nothing, it's fallen on deaf ears. And they want to go ahead as indicated.
Coming up, Gail and Brian respond to questions of whether their concerns are being used to silence Palestinian narratives. They have had three Jewish groups consulted, from what I understood, right?
So clearly,
fringe Jewish.
Yeah, there has been clearly absolutely no consultation.
Brian, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I do. The bias and animus at the museum has been manifest for years. A couple of years ago, a Palestinian activist did a so-called die-in at the museum without being legally authorized to enter the museum.
And just for context, let's just tell her it was like December 2023.
2 months after
legally
October
authorized. They were let in. Jewish groups asked to do a counter demonstration, presenting their perspective. They went through the proper channels. They asked for legal authorization. They were refused. Several years ago, a senior official at the museum announced that they were going to do an exhibit about the daily indignities experienced by Palestinians. The bias and the animus has been manifest for a long time. Now, I don't expect a museum to take a one-sidedly anything position. I don't expect it to be a forum for advocacy for Jewish causes or Israeli causes. I expect it to carry out its mandate, which is to promote understanding of human rights and respect among peoples. Not only have they failed to consult with the mainstream Jewish community, not only have they Jew-washed this by citing the approving remarks of fringe organizations who are extremely hostile to Israel, I see no evidence that they have consulted credible, independent historians to actually give a valid academic perspective on this.
Which they actually have on staff, but have, I believe, deliberately failed to consult.
Yes, and I think that's a point that Gail's just made that bears very serious investigation. Yeah, staff is doing this. Which staff? What is the knowledge background of the staff? What is the staff's knowledge about the Middle East conflict? I see no evidence that there is any sensitivity to the fact that oral histories need to be cross-checked, verified against other oral histories, verified against archaeological and documentary evidence and checked against bias. The trick that they're trying to play on us is this is just storytelling. It's not just storytelling. One of the protagonists here said, we are telling, this is an exhibit by Palestinians for Palestinians, and we are telling the story. We are telling the story. There's only one story. So the story apparently is the vilification of Israel.
Just cutting to the chase here, why do I care? Well, first of all, I care about the credibility of the museum. And this, becomes, it brings its reputation as a credible, scholarly, research-based institute completely into disrepute. But as I repeatedly said, and as people have repeatedly said, this is a very, very difficult time for Jewish people. And we know that with the rise in anti-Semitism and the number of acts of violence that are going on, anything that is going to fan the flames of Jew hatred has to be scrupulously considered. Is this the right time? And is this the right way? And repeatedly, that question's been asked, and it seems to just fall on deaf ears. There is no, frankly, in my opinion, compassion around the museum management table and perhaps the board. And ironically, I was meeting with the museum the very same day that Minister of Public Safety, who is really trying hard, I think, to protect Jewish communities, came to Winnipeg to announce another $75 million for public safety measures and the Jewish communities at the top of the list. So I said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Maybe you don't want to have a federal institution like the CMHR fanning the flames of Jew hatred. So then you have to come and spend more money protecting us. He agreed.
You were mentioning the federal government. This is a federally funded institution. Having this exhibit in this museum gives it a cachet.
Yes, that's certainly how I feel about it. It's got the imprimatur of the federal government, and it's got a higher responsibility for accuracy, balance, history, context, and all that. And I think they're failing to meet it. So that's what we are hoping that, cooler heads will prevail around the board, because all I've asked for is, could you please review this and have a credible team? I know groups like the Raoul Wallenberg Center have offered to review it and say, what are we missing here? That is what I did when I was doing all of the exhibits at the outset of the museum, and it was a massive job. We brought in third-party peer reviewers before anything went public. We had to walk through the museum, and everything was looked at, and things that needed to be changed, wording beefed up, and there was a lot. That all happened because we had a responsibility to provide the truth to the public as well as we could. And by the way, there's a precedent with the Holocaust Memorial in Ottawa, where the Jewish community was unhappy with the wording. Department of Canadian Heritage called in an advisory group to review it, and they came forward with recommendations on changes, which are now being implemented. So it's possible to do a review, make the changes, and then go forward. And I encourage the board to revert to being the force for good that I envision the museum. Bring people together. We're supposed to be a place of dialogue. So don't avoid the hard truths. But there's a lot to celebrate. The 2 million Jews in Arabs in Israel who, there's Palestinians who did not leave Israel, who were welcomed, who were made citizens, who are members of the Supreme Court and deans of law schools and of course, members of the Knesset. So my final words were, please be a force for good. Please bring people together. That's why we created you, for dialogue. And instead, don't create silos and rifts and enmity, which is what's happening now, unnecessarily.
The critics will say, and I'm sure you've heard it, but I need to ask you the question, that by even speaking out, the Jewish community is silencing Palestinian voices.
From day one when my dad talked about this, there was never an intent to silence legitimate suffering and the legitimate stories of the Palestinian people who were displaced. So all we've ever asked for was for the exhibit to be paused if necessary, although you can do things pretty quickly, but reviewed, and given its troubling group of informants, have the exhibit reviewed by the Jewish community leaders, historians, to make sure that you do have the balance and historical context. So we do not want to silence the voices. You don't have to. You don't have to silence. My dad was the biggest debater. He welcomed the challenge. So just let me have the opportunity to make the case. So we're saying we need to have the opportunity to make the case because it's part of the same thing. I said if you were telling the story of the displaced, the creation of India in 1948, same thing. Britain partitioned India into Pakistan and India. Muslims went to Pakistan, Hindus went to India. 8 million of each were transferred over. So that's a 15 million worth of refugees going to different countries. You would never tell the story of the Hindus without telling the story of the Muslims. So it's only in this case that somehow the voices that are really being silenced are the Jewish voices.
It's not a question of free speech at all. Anybody's allowed to say pretty much anything they want. It's a question of what views are being platformed or what views are being excluded by a national cultural institution. We can explore hard truths. Nobody's asking the museum to distort factuality in the interests of politics. I'm against that in all forms, whether it's the university, the CDC, but I'm also against selectively excluding people who have truths to tell. I'm against platforming Jew hatred, and I'm against national cultural institutions making it even more unsafe to even be openly Jewish in this country.
Yep.
And what is the Canadian Museum of Human Rights doing? It is fueling the flames. It is making a terrible situation worse.
And that's my concern about the study guide, because even though this is in Winnipeg, the impact of national dissemination of this, in my view, very biased narrative, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel narrative is going to land potentially in schools, and then that will result in more of the bullying that we've heard about and potentially worse.
How do you think that's playing out? Because getting an Israeli lawfare organization to deal with this here in Canada may not sit so well and may make it actually worse for the Jewish community. Do you know what I mean?
Somebody had to step up. We, the mainstream Jewish community, should have stepped up long ago. We knew this was happening at least 2 or 3 years ago. We had public statements by people like Matthew Cutler about platforming the vilification of Israel.
He was the former head of the exhibits before he moved to United Way.
Why have we not done a more effective job, mainstream Jewish organizations? Well, it's not all our fault. Partly the museum chose to deliberately bypass us. Partly the museum chose to engage in Jew washing. Oh, look, independent Jewish voices of peace. They say they're Jewish, so it must be okay. You can't always blame the victims here, but we Jews in Canada have to do some very hard thinking about why it took Shurat Hadin to step up, why this had not already come from mainstream Jewish organization. That's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, and then I, as the person that worked for 14 years, 24/7 until we opened in 2014, founding this and spearheading this institution, which I love, and which, by the way, still does very good work. There are many, many, many wonderful programs, including Dimensions and Testimony, talking about Holocaust survivors. But this colors everything for me, and I naively trusted that a simple request that seemed pretty obvious would be respected and incorporated into an exhibit, and we were completely blindsided in November when this exhibit was out of the blue announced. I mean, it's been talked about, but it's been kind of mooted for years. But so I feel a personal responsibility, which I don't have. I don't control the museum. I'm not even on the board, but I have a lot of donors who are asking me, like, what is going on? And so I cannot rest. I need to do everything I can to try to avert the severe decree of having this kind of dangerous narrative that is so anti-Israel, anti-Jewish going forward in its current form.
I want to thank you for the extended conversation. And it's good to meet both of you. Appreciate the time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. After our interview, I asked the museum what the exhibit was costing. A spokesperson told us the budget is approximately $150,000. There is one Jewish member on the museum's board of trustees, but they declined an interview request. I also contacted Abigail Bakken, a University of Toronto professor whose name appeared in museum documents as being a member of the exhibit's advisory panel. She's also a member of Independent Jewish Voices and has written extensively on Palestinian rights, has publicly supported BDS campaigns, and declined to comment until after the exhibit opens. The CJN has been invited to attend the media preview on June 26, so we'll continue to follow this story. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman and Izzy Helenchild, with Michael Freeman, the executive producer, and Alicia Richler as editorial director. Let us know what you think about this story. We're at info@thecjn.ca. And thanks for listening.